Welcome to the Anxious Love Coach podcast, the place to be to create meaningful, conscious, secure, long-term partnerships. Here we talk relationship anxiety and creating healthy dynamics with your partners so that you can experience that secure, loving connection where you both feel committed and confident. My name is Natalie Kennedy and I'm your host. I'm a relationship anxiety coach and meditation teacher. I've had a practice for 9 years working with clients battling anxiety. And after experiencing an extraordinary shift in my own healing relative to relationships, now work to combine my personal experience as well as my training to help others trust themselves within relationship. I've been to the edge and back with my partner for my own relationship anxiety and have come out the other side, feeling consistently blessed and at ease in my partnership. I want to pass the tools I've learned along to you to help you trust yourself in relationships and also create magnetic dynamics with your partner. Our partners are our mirrors designed for our expansion, and the challenges exist generally to wake us up to ourselves, not destroy our beautiful partnerships. I believe most mainstream relationship advice today can be a huge source of anxiety and dissatisfaction. So let's jump in and normalize the challenges that we go through, call out the limitations of today's messages about love without being old-fashioned, and awaken our intuition and wisdom. If you haven't yet, be sure to join our communities over on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Anxious Love Coach. You can also request a 30-minute relationship anxiety assessment with either me or my co-coach Sheridan for one-on-ones, or join one of our group programs over on my website at www.anxiouslovecoach.com. I've also got a wonderful relationship anxiety meditation for you as thanks for subscribing to my email list. Thanks for being here and enjoy the show. Hello there, welcome back to the Anxious Love Coach podcast. And I just want to say to the Anxious Love Coach YouTube, we are trying something new today for the new year and accomplishing 2 things at once. So if you follow me on the podcast, maybe you want to subscribe to me on YouTube. And if you're subscribed on YouTube, maybe you want to follow me on the podcast. Today's episode, first of all, Happy New Year. Today's episode, ironically, even though we're at the beginning of a new year, is actually going to be about death and endings. And it might sound so strange to start out the new year talking about endings and death, but I actually am hoping that in discussing this, it's going to grant you a perspective that will bring you more aliveness. The thing that inspired this topic for me today is because I noticed during the new year, I even fell victim to this programming myself, that it seemed to be a time when everyone wants to set New Year's goals and intentions. And I even asked my mother, I was like, what are you gonna do this year? And she was like, the same thing I always do. And it got me thinking, man, we really put a lot of pressure on ourselves to just become totally different people during the new year. And the irony, although numerically we are entering a new year, seasonally, we are still in the thick of endings and death. If you think about the seasons, spring is actually the time of rebirth, and when the seeds under the soil start to sprout and move in the direction of full bloom in summer, starting to die as we harvest in the fall, and then in the winter is just a time of stillness and hibernation and kind of being and stillness and reflection. And what do we do during that time? What do we do as a society during the dead of winter when it's cold and still? Well, we light everything up and we celebrate and we party. And when your internal world doesn't match the energy of the outer world, that seemingly is the case around Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, arguably all the way even through Valentine's Day, when our internal state doesn't match the high energy that is forced upon you during this time of year, you might think there's something wrong with you or that there's something broken, but there really isn't. 2022, I really put a high priority on simplifying my life. Part of that was returning to a solo venture here at ALC and not having staff. Part of that was stepping off Instagram because of the output it required of me, and the relatively, it's not completely, but the amount of output I was getting was not equal to the amount of input I was getting emotionally from it. So I'm still riding that. I'm still riding that wave. I have very little impulse to put myself out there in a very intense I should be doing this kind of way. So if, and I love to create. I'm a creator at heart. I'm an artist at the heart, at my core. I'm an artist. I love putting things from the inside to the outside. But I don't feel that impulse during this time of year. And as I said, I'm very creative. So if I'm not feeling it, I'm guessing a lot of you might not be feeling it either. You might be feeling an inclination to do nothing and to rest. And just notice how deep our programming goes as a society, telling us that we need to be doing a lot right now. You need to be setting goals. You need to be going to the gym. You need to be starting something radically new in the dead of winter. No, it's just numerically a new time of year, but collected, like seasonally, we're still in winter. This is not a time to start brand new things. It might be a good time to think about what you might like to manifest over the next, and I use the word manifest very loosely in the sense that, what would you like to materialize in your outer world and in your inner world over the next year? But I wouldn't start to break any giant habits right now or create any new ones. It's I get anxious sometimes during the holidays because my inner world doesn't match the outer circumstances. I really want to rest and sleep a lot. I've been sleeping so much. I go to the spa. Obviously, this is a luxury that I have both been granted and chosen, to be able to rest and take good care of myself. Obviously, there are limitations that a lot of other people have that don't have the same privileges. So I'm doing my best to support those that don't have it, and at the same time, take care of myself. So there's a little tension and like guilt that comes up even right now. Like, oh, am I doing enough? And maybe you have that too. I think no matter how well off you are or how not well off you are, there's always an awareness that someone has it worse than you. And so with that awareness, you get to decide how much or how little feels appropriate to you. I do not recommend giving from an empty cup. And I'm not sure quite where that came from today, but it just felt like, it needed to be said. Do not give what you can't, don't give what you don't have to give. Right? That's a great recipe for resentment. And then you will poison your interactions with your resentment. Give what you have extra to give. So I'm fortunate that I have an abundance of time and somewhat energy to be able to kind of give freely and put content out there because I love it. But at the same time, I'm looking at things like Instagram, which were a total energy suck. So I just come on as I want to and a little bit less. Ooh, I'm noticing that just like looking at myself in the camera right now. If you're watching this podcast, like obviously you don't see it, but I'm not used to doing long form content with no one watching, getting ready to go out into YouTube. And so there's like a little bit of vulnerability here. It's like I'm being seen. So let's talk about death and endings. Although this is a relationship anxiety podcast, it's important to talk about death and endings because I think so much of what creates anxiety for us happens because we are in resistance to endings. We think that if we think hard enough or we try to control other people, that somehow we will be able to prevent pain and heartbreak and loss. And while that is true to an extent, obviously you don't want to be complacent and not care about certain things that are important to you or not actively put care into things that are important to you. But many of our listeners here, I can make a guess, are doing more than enough to sustain the things that are important to them. In fact, I would argue that they are maybe doing too much. Maybe you are nitpicking your partner because you think that if you don't nitpick them, that they won't learn or they won't grow or they won't love you in the way that you want to be loved. And you think that by controlling how they think and behave, that you can make them into this person that will love you perfectly. And that way you can prevent 5 years from now being disappointed in where your relationship is and have to leave and break your own heart. Right. But a lot of times the opposite happens. It's when we nitpick, we drive the people away and we don't give people the opportunities to let life teach them something, right? You want to be the teacher of, if you're a controller, you want to be the teacher, you want to be the influencer in your partner's life. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, to what extent are you, like, every time your partner puts an article of clothing in a place that you don't want them to put an article of clothing, are you naming it right then and there in a moment where things were really sweet, or can you choose to kind of put duct tape on in that moment and maybe share at a better time and have discernment, right? Or maybe you've got someone in your life, not even a partner, who's going through a difficult time and you feel the impulse to rescue them. And you think that that's love because maybe that's what love has been for you. Love is rescuing. Do you have a belief that love is rescuing? And maybe your new definition of love can also be love is letting people discover truths for themselves without your input. That can also be love, right? So this is definitely a time to lean back, take care of yourself, keep your eyes on your own paper, and use this time to reflect on how you are draining your own energy. So for me, during this time of year, I feel much more called to close my eyes and meditate and sleep and simplify. So here we are on YouTube/podcast, and it's really wonderful. It's kind of cool. It's kind of awkward. It's kind of weird, but we're trying new things and willing to look silly, right? Anytime we try something new, we have to be willing to look like we're new at doing this thing. So if I look like I'm kind of new to making a YouTube video, it's because I am. And anytime you try something new, you're going to kind of suck at it at first. So here we are. In a culture that is so obsessed with anti-aging and holding on to things that bring us joy for as long as possible, even beyond their expiration date, for those who want to be happy all the time or are really, really attached to happiness. I'm not saying that we shouldn't want to be happy. That's not the case. But a lot of times there is something we need to see, something we need to learn from our emptiness, or something we need to learn from our loneliness or our grief or our disappointment or our anger before we're able to get the insight that actually would allow us to find meaning and joy. So a lot of us are trying to cut corners and thinking that if we just avoid death, avoid conversations about death, avoid conversations about endings, that we can just kind of spiritually bypass our way to happiness, not realizing that happiness is, I don't even like the word happiness. I prefer joy, because happiness is like, I don't know, for me, there's people have different definitions of what happiness is. But for me, happiness is like a very conditional, superficial type of thing where it depends on circumstances. Maybe someone else has a different definition of happiness, but I'm sharing mine. Happiness for me is very conditional on circumstances. I like the word joy because it's like a spark that comes, and sometimes it comes in response to circumstances, and sometimes it's just the joy of being alive. And notice that aliveness can be sadness. And we can still be grateful to be able to feel. We are grateful to be able to feel the extent of our joy, or the extent of our grief, the extent of our sadness and disgust and anger and sexual excitement, right? All of these emotions give our inner lives depth and richness. And there is, I hope, as you start to do more work with your emotions, whether it's just sitting and observing them or actively making art with your emotions through movement, through dance, through painting, through music, whatever your outlet is for your emotions, I hope that even in the dark emotions, you can find a weird little peace or joy out of it. So, and the emotions are in response many times to things that happen to us, and that includes death and loss. I've been thinking a lot about death lately, partially because we're at the end of the year, but also because I may be entering a new season in my life. I definitely felt like part of my business died this year. I was like, I am tired And the structure of my business that was very hustle focused and trying to get as many clients as possible in as short a period of time as possible, that model stopped working for me a while ago. The model of I need to put out 3 TikToks a day, or I need to post on Instagram every day, or I need to be visible on stories every day, or I need to do this every day, or else, that stopped working for me. And so with that has come a big transition in my business as I start thinking about having kids and what I will need to actively let go of in order to make space for taking care of my health in a really extraordinary way, to prime this container for a baby over the next year, perhaps. As I start thinking about that, like, I have actively had to let certain things go. And there has been grief in that, because those things have served me in the past in a very profound way. Knowing how to work really hard in a company that I built was a skill I needed. And I also needed to learn how to step back and sit back and relax. They're both important skills at different times in different places. But I think when something is going really, really well, a lot of us think it needs to be that way forever. And it doesn't. Just because something worked for you a year ago doesn't mean it's going to work for you now. And what works for you now might not work for you 10 years from now. So we need to be willing to be flexible, and we need to be willing to let things end, because to the degree that we're not willing to let things end, we will suffer greatly and unnecessarily when they do. I'm not saying you won't feel grief, but there's grief, and then there's the judgment that we place on top of grief that makes it intolerable. There can be a sacred practice in grieving where it's like, I am going to actively grieve for the next year, something like this. Imagine you had a big breakup. Okay, this year I'm going to grieve. So there's doing these things consciously, and then there's doing these things, I guess we could say, unconsciously. But you're up against a lot of resistance, because in today's society, we don't do that. I was just thinking about a book I read maybe 5 years ago called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. He is a fantastic writer who is also a surgeon and writes about his medical experiences. And one of the things he talked about was how people often have such a hard time acknowledging this big elephant in the room, which is death and endings. And, you know, at best, in the circumstances where we don't like talking about death, we have a will and everything is neatly laid down, or we neatly put them into a nursing home and they die and everything's been agreed upon, but like we never really had to have a conversation about it. At worst, we're not paying attention to our elderly as they're dying, and we're assuming what they want and not actually giving them what they do want, because we never had a conversation about the fact that, like, dad or mom or grandpa, you're going to die. How do you want to die? And these are uncomfortable conversations, but it's so important. Or if your relationship is dying, if your relation, or if the version of your existing relationship is dying and you're moving into a new version of your relationship, it's still ending. It's still a death. The relationship you had is over. It doesn't mean that you can't continue it in a new way, but endings are a part of life. You're going to change. Your partner's going to change. Your relationship will either end and you go your separate ways, or it will end and you will go your separate ways in terms of a dynamic, and the dynamic will change. Endings are built in to life. And as we transition from one thing to another, we pass through endings, we pass through transitions and death. And we want that to happen. It's what brings life and rebirth and initiations and color into things. We need to have contrast. Where there is life, there needs to be death. Where there is light, there has to be shadow. We need contrast. A lot of us think enlightenment means I'm going to be happy forever and there's not going to be any sadness. No, enlightenment is just you're aware of contrast now. And contrast is something that's inevitable. You cannot get rid of contrast, meaning grief and love, light and shadow, surprise and disappointment. All of these things, we have to make space for all of the opposites, all of the contrast, the good and the bad within the good within the bad within the good within the bad, the good within the bad within the good. We have to look at all that stuff. And if we're going to talk about aliveness and what it means to be a person with a rich inner world, someone who's willing to feel a lot of emotions to the extent that they are there and express them in a heart-centered, I guess, way, well, we need to make room for the death of all those things as well. We need to make room for, if there's grief, there's death, something ended, right? How can we let ourselves feel grief without looking death and endings in the face? And I remember when I was with my teacher, Steffi Price, years ago, and I had this like conceptual understanding that things end. I understood it logically. But there was a moment where in meditation, that realization landed in my bones. It landed in my body. It wasn't conceptual anymore. It was like, oh shit, all of this really does end. And when that happened, my chin just dropped to my chest and I wept. I cried so hard, knowing that I was going to die. Everyone I loved was going to die. My relationship was going to die. Preston was going to die. Every hobby that I had will someday end because I won't have the physical ability to do it anymore. My toes will someday not work and I won't be able to do tango. Like everything, everything ends. But also these difficult emotions you're feeling, they're going to end too. These wonderful emotions you're feeling, they're going to end too. Everything ends. Your friendships will end, or your dynamics with your friendships will end. And when you realize this, it does something to you quite permanently. If you understand it in your body and not just in your mind, if you're willing to touch the vulnerability of the reality that all of it ends, you will wake up with a profound appreciation for another day. And it's quite a game changer. And it makes you look at your partner and think like, oh, I get you today too. Oh, and that doesn't mean that you force things to happen. It just means that you see things for what they are, the impermanence of it all. I guess this is a very Buddhist type of podcast today. But when we have anxiety, it's often because we are trying to avoid some kind of pain. We're trying to avoid grief. And that means we're in resistance to death. We're in resistance to endings. One of my favorite mantras, and I actually came up with it, I think. And if someone else came up with it and I heard it from you, well, I don't know how we would find that out. Maybe let me know. But I think in meditation, there was a humble realization, and this sentence came with it. And it's a sentence, of course. Of course. So something ends. Someone in my life gets sick. Of course. People get sick. People die. Of course, a friendship ends. Well, of course. Of course it ends, because everything ends. That doesn't mean I actively try to force things to end in advance. It's like, well, I can actively end things, or things will be ended for me, because that's how life works. Just like things begin, things end, and just like things end, things begin. This is a duality that we're living in. So I love this sentence, of course, because it implies a non-resistance to life as it unfolds. So I encourage you guys, as you listeners, to make space for death in your life, in your lives, make space for endings. And when the grief comes in response to some death or some path that you didn't choose that you're leaving behind, maybe it's you decide to get married and you leave your single life behind, or you decide to have a child and you leave your child-free life behind, or you take a job and you didn't take this other job, or you chose your passion but you left behind your security, or you chose security and you left behind your passion, right? In the path to hopefully having it all, there are going to be times where we don't have it all and we choose to leave something behind actively, consciously. And when the grief comes up, we often make that mean that we've done something wrong. Wrongness was never a part of it. Wrongness is a judgment. A judgment happens in the mind, and judgments will happen no matter what. And we can certainly use our intellect to help us make decisions. But your grief, your sadness as a result of leaving something behind doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It could just be a rite of passage. When you become a mother, and I haven't become one yet, but I'm ready for it. I guess I won't know until I get there. But I am ready to face the grief of losing my identity not as a mother. I'm very much anticipating that that's going to happen Even though I've lived a very full life up until this moment and I feel ready to have children, there's going to be a grief when that happens. And that doesn't mean that anything's wrong. That's just a part of life. It's a part of loss. And loss is normal. In a society where we don't want to let people grieve their losses because we're so obsessed with being happy and we're so death averse that we don't even want to look at dying people. We just want to put them in a nursing home. We don't want to look at suffering dead in the face and acknowledge, yes, this is a valid part of life. We don't want to look at that. So we judge ourselves when we see it. And we think that when we see it, because it's so rare, because nobody's showing it, that something's wrong. It's not. And related to anxiety, anxiety a lot of times is a resistance to endings, whether, like I said, it's an ending of your relationship to something or someone, or an ending of the current dynamic of your relationship to something or someone. So the anxiety comes in resistance to the pain that comes with endings or resisting endings itself. We try to grip and control, and we think that this is going to make things magically not end. And that's not true. But one of the reasons that we do resist endings is because we lack self-trust in our ability to handle loss. And I can conceptually tell you that you have everything you need in order to handle loss. You might be able to intellectually know you're going to be fine on the other side of this and you're going to recover. But how do you know in your body that you're going to be okay? Part of it is witnessing yourself getting to the other side of this. So this is where kind of trauma comes into the conversation, where more than likely you experienced some kind of loss in the past, and the feelings that came up as a result were so overwhelming, which would have been one thing if you had support to be able to kind of cross the threshold of the peak of the emotion and be carried to the other side, or have a parent there that's like, this thing that you're feeling is called grief. It makes sense. I felt it too. It's normal. I'm here with you. You're not alone. That would allow us to move through the arch of the emotion. But if we never got to do that, well, we've never crossed that threshold. So how the heck would you know that you're capable of it if you've never done it? So it makes sense that we wouldn't trust ourselves. And as we study emotions and mindfulness and somatic experiencing with these emotions through sound, through breath work, through movement, I'm getting a lot more back into my yogic background these days, because really that's where my training is. But also I feel a pull to go back to that, to learn how to be with ourselves and almost be in two places at once, where we are the experience and we're also the witness of the experience at the same time. So this is how we learn to practice getting to the other sides of these big emotions and build trust in our abilities to do so, so that as life throws us more challenges, more heartbreaks and losses, and also new things that bring us joy, our capacity, a lot of us have resistance to joy. So big emotions in general, as we witness ourselves carrying ourselves through to the end of these emotions that are moving through us, because emotions are not permanent, they will pass. As we witness ourselves moving through these, we will trust our abilities to handle anything, because you're not afraid of endings. You're afraid of the feelings associated with endings. We're not afraid of what happens externally. We're afraid of how we think we're going to feel if that thing happens externally. So you're not afraid of your partner leaving you. You're afraid of heartbreak. Okay, let's make that distinction. You think you're going to feel heartbreak when your partner leaves you. That's not always the case. Some people feel relieved when their partner leaves. So it's all about context. And we got to examine, why are we afraid of heartbreak? Well, chances are you've gotten heartbroken before, and maybe it's still sitting in you a little bit, and you haven't really touched the peak of it. You haven't gotten to the other side. You haven't watched yourself finish feeling this emotion to the extent that it was meant to be felt. And when you do, and when you channel it through you and you discharge it, or you make art, or you touch it and you let it convulse you and you let it do with you what it wants and expose and reveal to you the wisdom embedded in this emotion, the story, you will have a lot more self-trust in yourself. So during this time of year, there might be a lot of conditioning, or even some programmed impulse to do a lot of things and set a bunch of goals. And if that is genuinely how you feel right now, because there's 8 billion of us on the planet, if you genuinely feel like doing that, then go for it. That's awesome. The people I'm speaking to are the ones who deep down intuitively sense that this is a time for rest, and they are not so much giving themselves permission to do so because of conditioning that says that now is the time you should be setting big goals and setting resolutions and trying to change yourself because apparently you're not enough as you are. Now, I strongly oppose that. So let yourself die, let yourself be reborn, and let yourself go through the stillness that this season has built in for you, and notice what surfaces inside as things get quiet around the world. It's kind of like right after the new year, and maybe the rest of the world had launched into a crazy speed, but you don't have to. You really don't have to. If you allow yourself to get still, a lot of the most beautiful spiritual insight that you could have can come during this time. And maybe big emotions will come because this is the one time a year where you have time to feel. So I don't know, maybe you're working like crazy hours again and there's no time to feel, but the stillness is built into this time of year. So I encourage you to use it. It's a very powerful time for reflection and meditation and sleep. Let yourself be spoken to through metaphor in your dreams and your visions. Let yourself journal. Let yourself channel through your aliveness through your hands as you write or paint or make music or dance. And like I said, I've been doing a lot of yoga lately, and it's been phenomenal just to be able to sit in child's pose. And many, many times my palms in child's pose face the ceiling and my chest just like collapses and tears come when I'm doing my yoga practice. So something is moving through me. I don't even always have associations or words or whys that come with the tears, but it's an energy, it's something old coming through. So let yourself grieve, let yourself feel. I know that we know this, but I'm just going to say the same thing we've all been saying. Let yourself go and let yourself feel. So that's it. Let death happen. Watch what happens when you let life unfold as it's meant to without your input. See how much power there is in embracing powerlessness in a weird way, in a weird context. So I hope that that's been of service to you. And if you watched this all the way through on YouTube, I commend you. That's crazy. And if you're on the podcast, I just want to say thank you for being a listener. I intend to put out podcasts every week now, which is really exciting. So make sure you're here. At the time of recording this, I don't know, I would probably post this in a few days. I can't speak for what will be by the time this is posted, but at the moment, I have one spot in my retreat with my teacher, Steffi Price, next summer in June 12th through 18th. I also have another retreat with Steffi Price on September 4th through 10th. And this is happening in Neumarkt and Steiermark in Austria. So this is going to be all about the inner relationship. And I have one spot left for June and I have 5 spots left for September. So I'm very surprised it's booked out so quickly. By the time this podcast is out, the June one might be filled out, but you're welcome to email me at natalie@anxiouslovecoach.com. I also talked more about the retreat in my last episode, the one on 3 tips to overcome jealousy. So if you want more info on that, you can listen towards the end of that last episode. But it's going to be all about the inner relationship and working with splits inside yourself. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about how that manifests externally in relationship too, but not a whole lot. So if you are interested, shoot me an email. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful new year. Enjoy the podcast and YouTube as things unfold, as things come out. And I hope that you have a wonderful week. Take care.
If you love Anxious Love Coach, please leave us a review. Every month, I will be choosing one review, posting the username on my Instagram page, and offering that person a personalized voice message response to any question of their choice via private message. Thanks for listening to The Anxious Love Coach today. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Please also subscribe to my email list at anxiouslovecoach.com, as I'm trying to reduce my reliance on social media. In exchange, you'll receive my free relationship anxiety meditation and a ton of information that I won't share to the general public about my personal challenges and learnings within relationship. If you would like to work with me and/or my co-coach, head on over to my website and click Start Here. Thanks for listening, and catch you in the next episode.